Over the years I've spent doing this work, one subject keeps surfacing more than almost anything else. It isn't the usual ground of why avoidant partners pull away, what their silence really means, or how you recover once they're gone. Those topics still matter and I'll keep coming back to them. But there's a question people bring to me more privately, more urgently than any other. Did the avoidant person actually build a real bond with them? Was what happened between you genuine attachment? Or was it something shallower, something easier to walk away from than your own feelings had convinced you it was? What I keep noticing in people coming out of these relationships is that the hardest part isn't only losing the person, it's not knowing whether any of it was ever real. They remember moments that felt, back then, like some of the deepest connection they'd ever felt. Then the withdrawal began, the silence crept in, and the avoidant behavior seemed to tell a completely different story, one where none of it mattered much, and leaving was simple. So now this person is caught between two realities that don't line up, what they felt deep down and what the other person's actions seem to confirm. They can't fully trust either one, and that unresolved gap is often more painful than the breakup itself. I want to actually close that gap today, not with hollow comfort, because comfort without real proof falls apart under pressure. I want to walk through the specific, observable signs that appear when an avoidant person has genuinely bonded with someone, because those signs look almost nothing like bonding looks like in someone securely attached. If you're reading avoidant behavior through a secure attachment lens, you'll miss the evidence entirely, even when it's sitting right in front of you. But before we name what an avoidant does once they've bonded, we need to understand what bonding actually costs them, why it's so rare, and what it demands of a nervous system built specifically to stop it from happening. For an avoidant person, forming a real bond isn't a smooth, natural unfolding the way it usually is for someone securely attached. There's no comfortable settling into closeness that feels welcome as it's happening. Instead, bonding registers in their system almost like an invasion, not because you did anything wrong, but because their entire inner structure was built to prevent exactly this. Those walls weren't put up carelessly. They were built on purpose, reinforced over years, and kept in place with the watchfulness of someone convinced, somewhere below conscious thought, that tearing the walls down invites the same pain that showed up the last time they let someone matter. So when real bonding does happen, when someone actually slips past the defenses and settles somewhere inside the avoidant that can't be undone, it becomes one of the rarest, most significant things that can happen to them psychologically. It doesn't feel like falling in love in any warm, welcome sense. It feels closer to an intrusion, something that happened without their consent and can't fully be reversed. Picture waking up and realizing someone has quietly become essential to your inner world without ever being given formal permission to be there. This is what creates the strange, indirect signals I'm about to walk through. Nothing like the open declarations a securely attached person would give you, but just as meaningful once you know how to spot them. The first sign that an avoidant has bonded with you shows up disguised as self-criticism. It slips out sideways, buried in a bigger conversation, never flagged as important, because flagging it would mean admitting why they're saying it in the first place. It sounds like I'm just not good at this, or I've always done better on my own, or I'll probably mess this up somehow. I've mentioned this kind of statement before, but in the context of real bonding, it carries far more weight than it appears to. When an avoidant offers this kind of admission without being asked, they're doing something that genuinely requires deep trust. They're letting you catch a glimpse of the wound, not fully exposed, not with the lights on, but through the sideways angle of self-deprecation, which is honest and deniable at once. They're telling you something true, while leaving themselves a way out if it isn't handled gently. The way to know whether this is a real bonding signal rather than a warning sign is what happens right after they say it. If it's genuine, there's a quiet pause afterward. The avoidant's nervous system silently watching to see whether what they just handed you gets honored or brushed off. If you respond with warmth, without trying to fix them or dig for more than they offered, something registers inside them that they rarely get to feel. That being vulnerable didn't end in rejection or in being smothered, and that you specifically can be trusted with the real version of them. That registration strengthens the bond whether or not it's ever put into words. The second sign is something I call the precision memory. Weeks or even months earlier, you mentioned something in passing during a conversation that felt completely unremarkable at the time. Then one day, out of nowhere, the avoidant brings it back up accurately, specifically, with a level of detail that proves they weren't just half listening in the moment. They've been carrying it, replaying it during the quiet hours when whatever exists between you lives in their mind and gets turned over with an attention they'd never admit to giving. This is one of the most intimate signs of real bonding, and also one of the easiest to overlook because avoidants don't do this with just anyone. In most of their relationships, they're skilled at staying present enough to function while staying distant enough to feel safe. They don't hold on to small details from people who haven't reached a depth in them that makes remembering automatic. So when they recall something you said with striking precision, something you'd nearly forgotten yourself, that's the signal. It means your inner world has become genuinely important to them without their conscious permission, and they've been living with what you said long after the conversation was over. The third sign is harder to catch because it often looks like the opposite of intimacy. It's what I'd call the future reference, and it's usually woven so casually into ordinary conversation that most people never register its weight. This happens whenever the avoidant, without being prompted, includes you in some vision of their future, not necessarily romantic or explicit, but specific. They mention wanting to show you something one day, or take you somewhere, or describe some future moment with you already written into it, even though they didn't need to phrase it that way. For someone securely attached, this kind of casual future planning is completely normal. Two people who like each other naturally picture things together down the road, but for an avoidant, it's never casual. Picturing you in their future represents a level of psychological merging their entire attachment system is designed to block. An avoidant who hasn't bonded keeps their future strictly their own, self-contained, self-sufficient, not dependent on any single person's presence. The walls don't just protect the present, they protect the future too. So when they place you inside that future without saying it directly, they're telling you the wall has already been broken through. You're already living inside the part of them that stretches forward in time, whether either of you has said so out loud yet. The fourth signal is probably the most revealing and also the one people are least likely to recognize for what it is. I think of it as the territorial disclosure. When the avoidant tells you something they've never told another soul, it doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's small, a fear they've never spoken out loud, a childhood memory no one else has ever heard, some private way they see the world that they've kept hidden away because sharing it feels like handing over something they can never take back. At some point, a bonded avoidant will hand you something that belongs strictly to their inner world, and they'll do it while downplaying it at the same time. That way, if it isn't received well, they can claim it was never a big deal to begin with. What matters here is understanding the cost. This isn't the cost of a hard conversation or a heavy emotional night. It's the cost of a specific piece of a specific wall coming down, one that was never meant to come down for anyone. The fact that it came down for you, that you built enough safety and trust to make that survivable, is about as direct a proof of genuine, lasting bonding as an avoidant communication style can offer. It's rare and it's real, even when it doesn't look like the grand gesture you might have hoped for. The fifth sign is probably the hardest one to hear, and I want to handle it carefully because it runs against the pain you may already be carrying. I call it the push away that carries your name. This is a particular kind of withdrawal that happens once bonding has gone further than the avoidance system can tolerate without sounding the alarm. It's different from their usual low-level distance keeping. This is a full, urgent retreat, triggered because their nervous system has started treating the attachment itself as a threat to their survival. Here's what sets it apart. It's specific to you. It points to your particular qualities, your way of being, as the actual reason for the pulling away. They'll say things like, "You make me feel too much," or "I can't do this with you," or "Being with you is too intense." Someone who hasn't bonded doesn't need a reason tied specifically to you. They just quietly make space. But someone who has bonded and is frightened by what that means has to name what they're running from, and what they're running from is you, not intimacy as some abstract idea, but the specific, irreplaceable reality of loving you, which their system isn't yet built to hold without shaking. That push away is, in its own painful way, a kind of confession. Not one that gives you what you deserve, but one that reveals the size of what actually existed, how deep the bond truly went, and how undeniably real you had become to them. Not closeness in general, but you specifically, as someone their inner world couldn't hold without the whole structure of their self-reliance starting to crack. There's a sixth sign that works a bit differently from the rest. It's more about behavior than words, though it shows up wrapped in its own kind of language. I call it unrequested protection. I've touched on this before, but it deserves a closer look here for what it reveals about bonding specifically. Once an avoidant has genuinely bonded with you, something shifts that's almost instinctively protective and almost entirely unconscious. They start doing small, practical things that safeguard your well-being, things that require a level of attention to your life that only real investment produces. What's telling is how they talk about it afterward. They'll do something that shows deep, specific care for your needs, then describe it in language that makes it sound like nothing, like it took no effort, like anyone would have done the same, like there's nothing worth reading into it. That casualness is the giveaway. Someone who doesn't care has nothing to play down because there's no weight there to hide, but someone who bonded and feels uneasy about what that bonding reveals has to offer the caring gesture while keeping it deniable. So they hand you the gift, then immediately tell you not to look at it too closely. Look anyway. It's the most honest thing they're capable of giving you in that moment. The words are the defense, the action is the truth. Now I want to name something important because I think there's a real risk in hearing all of this. I've just walked through 6 specific signs: the sideways admissions, the precision memories, the future references, the territorial disclosures, the push away with your name inside it, the quiet protection, and I understand the pull to take all of this, not as information about what was real, but as fuel to keep hoping for a connection that isn't currently serving you. That pull makes sense, especially after spending months or years wondering whether what you felt was ever real. Getting confirmation that the bond was genuine can feel like water after a long drought, and it's easy to drink far more of it than is actually good for you. So I want to be precise about what this evidence proves and what it doesn't. It proves that your experience was real, that the connection reached a depth avoidant defenses rarely allow, that you weren't inventing the meaning behind those moments, and that the closeness, the attentiveness, the disclosures, the quiet protective gestures were all genuine signs of a real bond, one that later got buried under avoidant behavior, but never actually erased. What it doesn't prove is that the bond alone was enough to build the relationship you deserved. Bonding and the ability to sustain a healthy relationship out of that bond are two different things. Someone can be deeply, genuinely bonded to you and still be working from a nervous system that isn't ready to show up consistently, day after day, in the ordinary way a real relationship requires. The bond was real, what you felt was real. And the gap between what they felt and what they were actually able to give you, that was real too. All three of those truths can exist together, and holding all three at once is probably the most honest place you can stand. I want to close on what I think is the most important shift in perspective from everything we've covered. Knowing that the avoidant person truly bonded with you doesn't change what they owe you. It doesn't lower what you deserve. It doesn't obligate you to wait around, to keep the door open, to stay as emotionally available as you've always been while they remain locked at whatever depth their defenses allow. What it does change is the story you tell yourself about your own instincts, about whether you were naive, about whether your love was responding to something genuine or something you built out of hope alone, about whether your ability to sense depth in another person before they're ready to admit it is something you can trust. Your instincts weren't wrong. What you sensed forming really was forming. The depth you felt was actually there. The moments that felt most meaningful were exactly that meaningful. You weren't fooled by someone who felt nothing. You bonded with someone who felt a great deal and simply hadn't yet learned how to stay inside those feelings instead of running from them. That distinction matters because it's what frees you from the most damaging version of this story, the one where your depth of feeling was the mistake, where loving fully was the flaw, where the next time something feels this real, you talk yourself out of trusting it. Trust it. Your perception was accurate. Your capacity to bond deeply and pay attention isn't a weakness. It's one of the most remarkable things about you, and whether or not that person ever finds the courage to face what they built with you, or simply carries it quietly behind the walls they retreated back into, they knew. In every remembered detail, every private disclosure, every retreat that had your name written into it, they knew exactly who they'd bonded with. And so did you. You weren't wrong about any of it. Let's sit with something for a moment before we close this out completely. Everything I've laid out today, the sideways admissions, the memories they couldn't help holding on to, the way you showed up in their imagined future, the private things they handed you and then tried to shrink, the retreat that had your name written all over it, the quiet acts of care disguised as nothing, none of it was an accident. None of it was your imagination working overtime to make sense of confusing behavior. These were real signals, produced by a real bond, coming from someone whose entire system was built to prevent exactly what happened between the two of you. That's worth pausing on, because so much of the aftermath of loving an avoidant person involves quietly convincing yourself that you must have misread the whole thing. You didn't. But I also want to be honest about something that tends to get lost in conversations like this one. Confirming that the bond was real is not the same as saying the relationship was healthy, or that it should be resumed, or that you owe the avoidant person another chance to get it right. Those are separate questions entirely, and mixing them together is one of the most common ways people stay stuck long after they should have moved on. You can know with complete certainty that someone loved you as deeply as they were capable of loving anyone, and still recognize that what they were capable of wasn't enough to build a life on. Both of those things can be true. In fact, for people who fall in love with avoidant partners, they usually are. What I want you to take from all of this evidence isn't a reason to wait. It's not a reason to keep the door unlocked, to hold your availability in reserve, just in case they eventually find their way back to what they started building with you. It's not permission to read every quiet, ambiguous gesture from here forward as proof that change is coming. People change when their nervous systems change, through their own sustained work, on their own timeline, often only after enough discomfort builds up that the walls become more costly to keep than to take down. That process, if it happens at all, isn't something you can speed up by loving harder, waiting longer, or holding on to the memory of how deep things once got. Your job was never to outlove someone else's defenses. It never will be. So what is this information actually for, if not to justify holding on? I'd say it's for something quieter, and in the long run, far more useful, rebuilding your relationship with your own perception. So much of the suffering that follows a relationship like this isn't really about missing the person. It's about no longer trusting yourself. It's lying awake wondering whether you're someone who falls for illusions, who mistakes ordinary interest for profound connection, who needs to be more guarded next time because your judgment clearly failed you once. That story is corrosive, and it's also untrue. Your judgment did not fail. You read the moment correctly. You felt something real because something real was happening. The failure, if there was one, belonged to a nervous system that couldn't sustain what it had started, not to your ability to perceive truth in another person. This matters enormously going forward, because the alternative, deciding that your depth of feeling is inherently a liability, will quietly sabotage every future connection you try to build. If you walk away from this convinced that loving fully is dangerous, that intensity of feeling means you're setting yourself up to be fooled again, you will begin, without realizing it, to hold back from people who might actually be capable of meeting you. You'll mistake caution for wisdom, when really it's just fear wearing a more respectable outfit. The lesson here isn't to love less carefully, it's to keep loving with the same depth, but get sharper about who actually has the capacity to receive it. That's really the heart of what I want to leave you with. This person bonded with you, that much I can say with confidence based on everything their behavior revealed, even when their words tried to say otherwise. But bonding was never the missing ingredient, capacity was. And capacity isn't something you can give someone, prove to someone, or love into existence on someone else's behalf. It's either there, actively being built, or it isn't. Your task now isn't to keep gathering evidence about what they felt. You already have enough. Your task is to decide clearly and without apology what you're willing to accept from a relationship going forward, and to hold that standard, even when it's tempting to lower it for someone who once made you feel deeply seen. You weren't wrong about the connection. You weren't wrong about the depth. You weren't wrong to feel what you felt. And you don't need anyone's confirmation, least of all theirs, to know that. Whatever they carry now, the memory of you, the parts of themselves they let you glimpse, the future they briefly imagined with you in it, that's theirs to sit with. What's yours is simpler and far more within your control, the certainty that you saw clearly, loved fully, and were not mistaken about what was real. That certainty doesn't need their return to be complete. It was already true the whole time.